So thank you all so much for attending. My name is Sofia Berger. I lead the Earth and Environment business here at WSP, and we're really excited that you came for this panel today to talk about the intersection of AI and sustainability. So I'm going to set the stage for a second before we dive into our conversation. So, what we wanted to talk about today was the fact that the development of generative AI is really causing this huge boom and need of computing power. And with that, there's driving demand for additional energy, water, and land at a rate that is really unprecedented. None of us have seen this before. Just, 2 data points to get us started on the discussion. Generative AI systems are estimated to use 33 times more energy to complete a task than task-specific software. Another interesting fact, the computing power needed to sustain AI's growth is doubling roughly every 100 days, which is really sort of mind-blowing. So, that's what we kind of wanted to dig in more, this expanding computing need and what it means for the commensurate resource needs in, again, energy, water, and land. But on the flip side, I think people are generally pretty excited about AI. Everybody is really excited about the promise and the kinds of solutions that it's going to bring on a variety of fronts, including potential solutions for sustainability itself, right? So, that's the balance that we really wanted to talk about today, the paradox, as the slide behind me says. How do we think about the crossroads that we're at right now? How do we embrace the promise of AI while responsibly reckoning with the resource needs of AI? So before we get into it, let me just briefly introduce our panelists. So starting here right next to me is Joyce Dickerson, Vice President for Global Sustainability and ESG at Ada Infrastructure. Joyce has over a decade of experience in global data center and IT sustainability strategy and operations. Prior to Ada, Joyce had multiple leadership roles at Google, most notably as global lead of data center sustainability, and also led sustainable IT infrastructure at Stanford University. Thank you, Joyce. Next to Joyce is Dion Harris, Director of Accelerated Data Center Solutions at NVIDIA. Dion focuses on driving product strategies for scientific computing and AI data center solutions, including NVIDIA's Earth-2 initiative. Additionally, Dion also serves as part of NVIDIA's Corporate Sustainability Steering Committee, where he spearheads many of the company's data center energy efficiency initiatives. Next down the line, we have John Frey, Chief Technologist at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. John developed and leads HPE's practice for customer collaboration on sustainability and IT efficiency. He partners with HPE's largest customers, stakeholders, and governments to develop low-carbon solutions to business challenges, share best practices, and drive new business opportunities. And last, but certainly not least, we have Lucas Joppa, Senior Managing Director and Chief Sustainability Officer at Haveli Investments. Lucas oversees Haveli's sustainability software and AI strategy across operations and investment opportunities. He has over 15 years of experience, including having served as Microsoft's first Chief Environmental Officer, where he founded the AI for Earth program, a $50 million cross-company initiative dedicated to delivering technology-enabled solutions to global environmental challenges. So now that we've introduced our panelists, let's return to the question at hand of these crossroads. How do we embrace the promise of AI while responsibly reckoning with resource needs of AI? So in kind of reverse order, Lucas, why don't we start with you? And first of all, do you even agree that we're at a crossroads? What do you think about that? And how do you think about what those crossroads mean in terms of tensions and possibilities?
Yeah. Oh, okay. First, thanks for having me. Before I get into the crossroads thing, I would just say I have been working on sustainability and AI basically my whole career. And I did partly found something called AI for Earth. But one of the things that's been exciting about being here is I have a bunch of old colleagues in the audience. It's kind of random how many people you run into in Manhattan during Climate Week. But the co-founder of AI for Earth is actually in the front row here as well. So
wonderful.
Just wanted to say that. But look, are we at a crossroads? I don't know. We are definitely at an inflection point, though. And I have, been thinking about these two issues for basically my whole career. And I've come to believe over the past year that, if there is a future to write history, it will write that how we react and how we respond and how we develop, deploy, these AI systems will be a critical inflection point on our journey to net zero or not. And the way I think is maybe controversial and maybe not. But for me, AI is not the problem. It's actually potentially the solution. And I'm not about to say ooh, look, a bird, look at all these crazy things AI can do, right? What I mean by that is that if we are ever going to decouple environmental degradation and climatic destabilization from our current socioeconomic systems, we're going to do so by following a 4-part plan. By decarbonizing the grid and then racing to electrify, digitize, and optimize our real physical economy. And so AI is actually a very good thing. It's a critical demand signal into the system that we need more electricity now. I think it's a tough thing because people have been saying that this is true. We need to electrify our economy. And then we're electrifying our economy and everyone's like, whoa, we can't use electricity. And you're like, using electricity is a good thing if where the electricity is coming from is from a net zero or low to no carbon basis. The good news is that we know how to do that. And the even better news is that the people that are developing AI are the same companies that have the most ambitious sustainable commitments in the world, that are the largest buyers of renewable energy in the history of the world and on a day-to-day basis, have probably the best renewable energy procurement teams in the world, and have the most money to be able to deploy in transforming the system. So those are the two kind of, good news about the demand signal. And the last bit is that we actually do need AI if we're ever going to optimize our relationship with the world's finite natural resources. And so I'm not actually that bullish on the way we're doing AI right now, but I am actually really excited that there's this massive demand signal into the market. So long and short of it, I don't think AI is the problem. Demand is potentially the solution. How we respond is going to dictate whether or not we do anything good or bad here.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and an important point about the load increase itself is not in and of itself the problem. It's just helping us to think about how to solve this. So Joyce, turning to you, if I have these metaphorical crossroads that I've been talking about, if that actually lands in an actual physical place, it's at a data center, right? So since that's exactly what Ada is involved in, creating those data centers, how is Ada thinking about that now? And one of the conversations we had, I think you said something along the lines that the constraint is really driving innovation and creativity, right? So necessity is the mother of invention. So, how is Ada thinking about that in developing data centers?
Yeah, good. Very good question. So I've been doing sustainable data centers for almost 15 years. And 15 years ago, when I said, hey, we're doing water cooling and we're using cooling towers and evaporating, I think that's a problem. We shouldn't be wasting all this water. And they're like, no, there's plenty of water. Don't worry about it. Well, it's a very different world now. So at Ada, we design and build intentionally sustainable data centers for AI and hyperscalers. And most of our team comes from the hyperscalers. I'm from Google. Our president's from Microsoft. We've got people from Amazon and Facebook. And we've been doing this with data centers for so long. So now our data centers, we built them with zero water. But we do liquid cooling. So it's zero water. We're cooling very close to the source of the heat, which is the chip, and ideally to the chip, the rack or the chip. And we process the water. Instead of evaporating it, we actually use electricity to bring it down to the cool temperature. Okay, great. So now we're using more electricity, but it's 100% renewable. So as you said, more electricity is actually better. But then the ironic thing is that messes up this metric that the industry has set called PUE, which is how much electricity we use. So if you were managing on PUE, you would say, oh, that's a bad idea. Go evaporate all the water off. But we're going to do what's actually right for the community and not what the metrics are telling us to do. So it's this lack of water restrictions, we actually work very closely with the communities that we're in. So the communities now are saying, don't build a data center in my backyard. We're saying, well, actually, we can work with you to build programs that actually enhance your community. We do job training, we do reskilling, we make green spaces available for the communities. So, these things, these problems that you run into are opportunities to actually do something better.
That's so interesting. And I'm so glad that you focused on water, because energy and water are two very different constraints, right? And so how we deal with them as we keep going is very different. So thank you. And then John, maybe moving to you. So, obviously HPE works on the components that go in the data center, but I know that in talking to you, one of the things you're passionate about is that we can't just look at this at a component scale. We really have to be looking at the system scale, and how do we get all of the different entities to work together? So, maybe you could tell us more about that perspective, please.
Yeah, happy to share that. So this, for me, has been a 25-year journey on technology efficiency. And by the way, AI doesn't break any of our perspectives on that. They just amplify a couple. And early on, we couldn't figure out why. There was a lot of work on the real estate side, as you just heard, to make the data center itself, i.e. the building and the cooling systems and things, as efficient as possible. And the IT in it was so inefficient. And then, talk to a couple hundred customers, you figure out, oh, the real estate team's #1 metric is utility cost reduction. So everything they do is to drive that. The IT team has no idea how much power the infrastructure consumes, or how much carbon it could be generated. And their #1 KPI is keep it running all the time, never let it go down. So what do you do if that's your #1 KPI? Put lots more than you need, lots of resiliency, everything's redundant, which of course is not the most efficient. So the first part of this journey was actually getting those two groups to have a common set of metrics. And they picked PUE. Why? Because all of the great work the real estate team did took the numerator and made it a little smaller, but the denominator was always still the IT load. So IT took a lot of credit for taking no action because PUEs went down. And then we taught them about 5 levers of technology efficiency, and they started doing the work. Because that was the denominator of the equation, PUE went the wrong direction. They panicked and stopped and said, well, we're not doing that. We just spent 5 years convincing our bosses that PUE was a great way to measure us. So part of this is resetting the expectations. Part of it is getting those groups together. And we started with 3 levers. Equipment efficiency, which is if you have a piece of technology equipment, do the most work you can with it. Yet even today, the industry average is about 30% of its capability, if you look globally. The second was energy efficiency. For every kilowatt of power you're going to consume, do the most amount of work possible and build power proportionality into the equipment. So if you're doing a low level of work, you consume a low level of power. If you, during a high level of work, consume more power. So all of the equipment shipped that way. But you know what we found? Over 80% of it, the first thing the IT team did when they received it is turn that off. Because they were thinking that would negate performance a little bit, and they're paid for great performance. So the third one was resource efficiency. How much cooling does it take? How many people does it take to manage the infrastructure? And all of those aspects. And so that's where we were charging along. But then one of the things we recognize is you can have the most efficient device. You can put 1,000 of them in racks and think your data center is efficient as possible. But if you put a horrible software application that's got terrible code, was written in the wrong programming languages on top of that, you've negated all that efficiency. So we stepped into software efficiency. And how do we teach coders to write better code, use better programming languages, and think about power efficiency of code? There was actually an organization stood up called the Green Software Foundation that's proposed a metric. It's not perfect, and IEEE's working on another one at the moment, but it's all called the software carbon intensity. And then we said, well, wait a minute, all of this inefficiency stems from how much data we're collecting. And to do AI, by the way, you need to collect an awful lot of data. And so we looked at across all the data that was being collected and all the storage arrays that were being purchased and all the power they consume and said, how much of that data is actually used by anybody ever? 30% or so. So our companies collect all this data that they're never going to use. That we use loses its value in some cases in less than a week. Yet nobody's asking the question, including your IT executives, by the way, do we actually need to store that data? And if so, for how long? And if we don't need it instantaneously, can we put it on a lower level of storage? So that was data efficiency. So for us, those 5 levers were the ones. So we have to think how to optimize all 5 as an integrated solution, not as piece parts. And because many of those elements were delivered by different companies, that was really hard. But one of the things I think that AI has accelerated is it's brought the data center designer, the chip designer and manufacturer with the equipment integrator, with the software stack, and sort of wrapped a bow all of that and said, you know what, let's design efficiency for this as a solution rather than focusing on the piece parts.
That's so interesting, and I love the way you told it, kind of pulling the thread of why until we get to it. And it's really a perfect segue into, what I was going to ask Dion about the computing efficiency, and obviously the chips itself are part of that. But, so much of what we're talking about is this projection of what the demand is going to be based on computing efficiency. And so, what are some of the innovations that you're seeing on that front that could help with the solution?
So I totally want to just plus one all the comments made so far first. And I think, John sort of hit it on the head, describing sort of the need for full stack integration. And so when you look at sort of NVIDIA and sort of our journey in the computing landscape, my mic is a little choppy here, so bear with me. But it started with pioneering what we call accelerated computing. And it was really looking at use case by use case. So first use case was graphics, right? You said, okay, if you take a CPU and you pull a parallel processor, call it a GPU, call it a PPU, whatever you want to call it, a parallel processing unit, next to that CPU, we can actually do this much more efficiently. Then in 2006, we said, okay, let's create an abstract layer called CUDA that will allow you to expose that parallel processing capability to other domains. The main reason to do that is that it was going to allow you to drive more performance within a same or smaller power envelope. And so we started doing that domain by domain, and it required us looking at the application, all the lines of code, where they could be parallelized, how it would leverage the underlying infrastructure, how it would leverage the actual storage, et cetera. So that is a very painful process. I mean, it's a reason why it took us, over 20-some years to get to the point where you really had a wide adoption of accelerated computing platforms. But what I will say is that discipline of understanding the application and how it behaves in concert with the computing infrastructure really is sort of ingrained in sort of how we approach building out our solutions. So now fast forward, AI has happened. We've already established that accelerated computing is a full stack problem. You have to optimize at all those layers of the stack to get the application to take advantage of that parallel processing. AI takes it even further because you're no longer looking at just the efficiency across one GPU or one system or one rack. You're looking at the entire data center. So now, to John's point again, you have to understand how that orchestration happens at a software layer, at the networking layer, at the compute, at the sheer memory that's shared across the compute infrastructure. So you're looking at compute fabric, compute network. And so now to kind of bring us to today, here and now, the latest architecture we have announced was our Blackwell platform. And what's really interesting, if you Google Blackwell, probably a 50% chance you will find a full rack. You won't see a picture of a GPU. And the reason why that is we've really looked at every element to say, okay, if we're going to go try to service these, sort of growing and increasingly demanding workloads, how can we do it as efficiently as possible? And the answer was it was everything. It wasn't just put more flops in the GPU. It was like, let's look at direct liquid cooling so that we can improve the overall compute density and make sure we can drive efficiency that way. It was also saying, let's look at switching out optical transceivers for copper transceivers, because we were going to have the systems closer together, better signal integrity, but also lower power, because you don't have those lasers moving data around. Other things we looked at were simple things like the memory that was on the CPU. For example, we developed a new CPU called Grace, which uses LPDDR5X, which is basically the memory that's in your cell phone, but we've hardened it with some error correction capabilities that basically said you can run this in the data center but consume a lot less power. In fact, it's about 4 times more power efficient than a typical x86 CPU. So, I kind of highlight some of that to suggest that, we literally looked at every facet of our architecture. And then we also looked and said, okay, how does that plug into the data center? Like, how do we interface with the MEP infrastructure to make sure that, the pipe pressure can facilitate a 120 kilowatt rack and all the liquid cooling that it takes to support that. The bus bars are adequately built out so that you can support that. So it really required, a full stack view of not just our solution, but the partner solutions. So I think this sort of notion that, this is forcing collaborative viewpoints of how you optimize, that was really sort of, foremost. And then, as a result of that, and I'll just sort of use this as a kind of drop the mic moment. As a result of all that, we were able to demonstrate 25 times more energy efficiency in terms of actual energy per token produced in terms of inference workloads. 25x doesn't happen in generation over generation improvements when you're focusing on the flops. You just can't. Moore's law, physics, all of those limitations come into play. But the fact that we were literally pulling every lever, I think as John alluded to, we possibly could to drive more efficiency, more performance, it resulted in that transformational.
That's incredibly interesting, and especially, the really specific cause and effect between each different piece and how you have to really understand it to get to that kind of huge improvement is so interesting. So, now that we've dived pretty deep into the details, we wanted to zoom back out a little bit more and just talk about the fact that these data centers and these resource needs are happening in communities, right? You touched on this a little bit, Joyce, and I want to return to this comment. They're happening in communities, which means real people. And, we at WSP work on all kinds of infrastructure. And one of the things we've seen across the board is a huge increase in the importance of public involvement in all kinds of infrastructure, justifiably so. But it makes it, it's a whole nother layer of complexity to add. And so, how do we think about involving the community and really understanding their needs as we're developing all of this increased demand and data center volume?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And at Ada, our preference is to go into brownfield sites, so we're not going into, we're going to communities. And a lot of our data centers are we're in London, we're in Tokyo, we're in Sao Paulo. And one of the things in London, for example, we brought in a team of local consultants that went and met with the community and asked them, what do you want? We don't know what you want. What do you want? And one of our sites actually in Japan, we asked the community, what do you want? And they said, well, we're actually really worried about natural disasters because we have flooding and whatnot. We just want a place to store all our emergency gear. I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that one. But, that's how we can help the community by talking to them. We have actually in our data center in London, we've actually built a community center, which will be available 50% of the time to the public, so they can go in and do STEM training for the kids. The teachers come in. We're part of our infrastructure. We're doing behind a glass wall, so we can show them. Oh, here's the the utility interconnect. So the excess hot water is actually going out to this apartment complex that's being built across the way to do all the heating for that community. So finding ways that we can engage, and each location is so unique that it takes that investment in finding the local NGOs who know the communities to give us that feedback, and then we build it, and we have a whole fund that we put together for that.
It's so interesting, and you're right, it is so location specific, especially when you're talking across the world, right?
Absolutely.
Other panelists on the question of community?
Oh yeah, there's a lot to be said for community, and let me actually back this whole conversation up for. We're here at Climate Week. We're talking about decarbonization, and we talk about it almost if it's a sterile thing, 1.5 degrees decarbonization. But let me take us back to what the impact of not taking care of that is. It's marginalized communities around the world that can least afford to adapt to a changing world that are impacted based on the decisions we all make. So it all comes back to community. And so part of this thinking through this is, how do we both do a better job, as you've heard, from an infrastructure perspective? But also, how do we do a better job of using technology to do a better job of weather forecasting, climate modeling? For example, up until about 3 years ago, you couldn't run a climate model of the globe if you included clouds. The best supercomputers, if you took the clouds out of the equation, you could do that. But it's only been some of the innovation that our chip partners have made and our research partners in departments of energy across the world and others to even say, we need a supercomputer that can actually do a better job here. So let's go do that. So there's community involvement actually in what are we going to go research? What are the needs? And we often don't think, for example, of the research community or the climate research community as a community, but it absolutely is. Give us the early warning and early indicators. Think about how much time we now have in terms of hurricane prediction and where it's going to hit. My wife and I volunteer for a disaster response organization, and I now get emails a week before saying, can you deploy this week in Florida, because the hurricane we think is going to be Category 4, and it's going to hit, and so we're going to have a lot of damage, and so we're going to need to mobilize a whole amount of responders. Where it used to be, and I've lived in Houston for over 3 decades, it used to be, there's a storm brewing, oh no, we're under 6 feet of water, now what do we do about it? So even in that sense of community, I think it's listening to the stakeholders. The last thing I would say there is, if you're someone that struggles with that, Stanford University has a great concept called catalytic collaboration. Go dig into that. But it's listening to not just the normal voices that you always think to go tap, the normal stakeholders, but look for the marginalized voices that you need to be listening to. Listen to the silent, unheard voices and intentionally call them into these conversations, and you avoid a whole lot of unintended consequences on the road when you do that.
Well, so, implicit in this, oh, sorry, did you want to say that? No.
Carry on.
So, implied in these answers and a lot of the other answers is just the fact that there are so many different stakeholders involved in everything that's going on right now. And so a critical part of how we tackle this situation is getting everyone to collaborate, right? And so, maybe with you, Lucas, you recently wrote an article talking about this divergent pace that many of the different actors are on, specifically the regulators, the utility firms, and the technology firms, and how they're all kind of, literally going at different paces. And we need to find a way to get them all converging on this conversation in order to really have solutions. So, maybe you could tell us a bit more about how you see that potentially happening across the industry.
Well, if you're looking to spot the tech exec in any crowd, just look for the person who alliterates everything they say. So I think I called that 2 sectors, 2 speeds. But yeah, it's a critical problem. And I think I would kind of wrap back to my comments at the beginning, where I painted a pretty rosy picture of what the demand from AI could actually enable. The demand from AI could be how and why we end up greening the grid. But success is definitely not guaranteed. We could totally screw this up. And the way that we would screw that up is by not collaborating, particularly between the tech sector, and I'm taking a very broad stack definition of the tech sector, software, hardware, componentry, full thing, and the utilities. And the 2 ways that could go wrong is if the tech sector just blindly puts that demand signal into the electricity markets, there is no guarantee that we will do the most economically efficient nor societally advantageous thing. There's all sorts of other constraints on the system, and it's very easy to throw your hands up and do the easiest thing, not the most economic thing. We could respond by bringing more coal and gas on. We could do that. That's not what tech wants, but if they don't collaborate, I'm afraid that's what tech will get. And as well, if we don't collaborate and tech doesn't get what they want, particularly electrons in the volumes in which they need and the times and places they need it, they will, because they have the resources to do it, just go do their own thing. And that might be okay for decarbonizing AI, but it's not okay for decarbonizing the world's grids. And that is the opportunity that I believe that we need to be chasing. And so we need these two sectors to work together, and they're not natural bedfellows. They are totally different cultures, totally different speeds, totally different unit economics, and, you know, strangely enough, don't know each other all that well. I mean, my Microsoft, old Microsoft colleagues will remember, we spent a lot of time saying things like, you know, without access to electrons, we don't have a product, and we would just be met with like blank stares. And so it's only been literally within, outside of the renewable energy teams inside these companies, it's literally been the last few years that these companies even understand that electricity is their core supply chain, right? And so anyway, my point is, collaboration is how we will do this right or wrong, and that is what history will ultimately judge us on.
I would love to insert another stakeholder in that collaboration, because it is directly related, which is, you know, the policymakers, right? Because I have a unique position in terms of I've worked at a utility and I've worked at a tech firm. To Lucas's point, the cultures are on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of how they view the world. The utility is thinking, I have a rate case, I have an investment base that I am approved to go and maintain and deliver the reliability. At all costs, I want to make sure that I can deliver safe, reliable power. Anything that jeopardizes that is something that jeopardizes my core principle. So moving very quickly to bring on any load, whether it's renewable or otherwise, goes directly to their core values. It's sort of the antithesis of why they exist. Whereas your tech ecosystem is trying to innovate as quickly as possible to help push the envelope, to help spur innovation. And so those two sort of core focuses are just inherently divergent. Now, the reason why I said that there's another stakeholder, which is policymakers, the misalignment of those two sort of objectives is very much rooted in the policy of how the rate case is determined, how utilities are rewarded, how they're incentivized to do certain things within the overall operation. So, I think to your point, collaboration within the tech ecosystem is starting to happen. I know we're being incredibly transparent around our roadmaps and making sure that everyone's ready for whatever is coming. And then at the same time, like you said, we're talking to the power companies. We're letting them know, where we think there's opportunities to improve their efficiency and what solutions we can offer to help that out. But also just, trying to be a good partner there. But you also understand that they're also somewhat hand-tied in terms of what they can do and how they can do it. So again, I think there needs to be an alignment of objectives, across this entire set of stakeholders as well.
And I know that NVIDIA has had a lot of successful collaborations. And is that, transparency and alignment really what you all have found brings that success?
So like I mentioned, NVIDIA is a unique company in that, we've always believed that our success comes from our partners' success. In other words, we only do well if HP can, build systems that support customers' needs that we're able to help. We only do well if the data centers can be stood up. And so our approach, thank you so much. This is, okay, yeah, thank you so much. So our sort of philosophical approach has never been about, we only win if we win and we're gonna try to get all the market share. It's always been about how can we enable an ecosystem to do well. And that's played out, when we talk about cloud, we say we support every cloud provider. When we talk about OEMs, we support everyone. We want everyone to do well. But I think there has been a shift in our sort of posture from a partnering standpoint, recognizing that it isn't just the systems makers that we need to partner with. We also need to partner with the MEP providers like Vertiv and Schneider Electric and Delta Electronics and Cool IT, and the list goes on. But they're the people who's actually building the hardware that goes in. But then to your point, we also recognize we need to work with people who are building transformers and people who are building the transmission lines and people who are actually creating the grid that this all operates on. So I think our expanded notion of the stakeholders has definitely heightened, just given the scale and scope and attention that's on this whole issue and topic of how AI will transform some of these different infrastructure pieces.
Yeah, really breaking down the silos and getting everyone to work together. So I'm going to ask one more question of the whole panel, and then we're going to go to the audience for questions. So start getting ready. Let's talk about workforce for a second. One recent author said that the explosion of AI was beyond human scale. So it was just moving faster than we mere mortals can keep up with. But yet, we mere mortals are very involved in all of these conversations and discussions and collaborations that we've all talked about as being the solution of how we're going to, work our way through this crossroads. So, how are you all thinking about the talent, the hiring, what you need as you staff up to, meet the moment?
In the data center space, and this has long been true, we need more people who can work and operate data centers. So one of the things a lot of that we do, and Google does, and Microsoft, all of us collectively have done, is try and support programs, for example, in the community colleges that are real sort of training programs and apprentice programs to really try and retrain people into this, mechanical and electricians and mechanical people and plumbing and everything. But also then we work with, going into the K-12 schools and sort of keeping the STEM education going. So any location we go into, we find, what are the adult education programs that we can help support and drive, and then what can we do in the schools as well to help sort of keep awareness of training and the skills that are really missing in many places.
That's great. I mean, really expanding the pipeline of people coming in. Others on workforce, talent?
So I agree with everything that was just said. And you heard me when I mentioned resource efficiency, mention people as part of that. Almost every tech leader that I talk to, and I talk to thousands of them a year, is having trouble attracting and retaining the talent they need. And so one of the things that we've found, for example, is when you can connect this work to do technology efficiently and the use of technology to drive decarbonization, turns out you can attract and retain more employees that will come work for you because they want to be part of that journey. So we're telling them, look, get your HR folks involved with you and talk about this work that you're doing. So that's one piece of it. The other one is, how do we look in terms of marginalized populations and increase that? It turns out, as we dove into software efficiency and looked at programming languages, one of the things that MIT pointed out in their business journal is that actually one of the most efficient programming languages from a power efficiency, runtime, first pass compile time, a whole variety of metrics, is a language called Rust, which is a compiled language. And it turns out that when the Rust community formed up their code of conduct on how they were going to interact with one another around the world, they were very careful to put in anti-discrimination language, and the community collectively enforces that. So what you find is a disproportionately high number of queer programmers that program in Rust because it was a welcoming community for them. They were encouraged. If somebody tried to pick on them or discount them, the community sort of came together and said, that's not permitted in our community. So as it turns out, even though you were looking for Rust because it's such an efficient language, there were other people benefits coming alongside of that. And it turns out it's a little harder to learn, apparently, but it's about 65 times more efficient than, say, Python, which is what students learn in school to code in, for example. So it's that. It's also one of the things that became very apparent to us is much of this that we've talked about in terms of technology efficiency, programming efficiency, is still today not taught in educational institutions. So our computer science and computer engineering students get none of power constraint factored into what it is you're doing. And so we're working very hard to fix that too.
Yeah, I would just jump in on the efficiency side because I believe in it strongly, but I try to avoid talking about it because I want to see as much demand get delivered into the grid as possible. But also because I think that it's going to get handled by kind of the market dynamics going forward, right? For those of you who pay a lot of attention to the cloud kind of market, you understand that there is, everyone talks about AI, but there is one trend, and it is gross margin pressure. that is all, right? And so for a long time, I do believe, to the comments we just heard, we have been building incredibly sophisticated software, and we've been developing and delivering into the marketplace, the workforce, incredibly skilled programmers, but they have not been taught how to write efficient code because they have not been incentivized to do so. They're sure as hell smart enough to do so, right? It's just not a design constraint because from a gross margin pressure perspective, that wasn't where the signal was coming from the infrastructure providers. But that's all going to start trickling down in a world of constrained resources, particularly we come through this bottleneck, whether it's water, electricity scarcity, and the like. And so there's obviously the big AI workforce questions about whatever, but, for the people that are actually like developing these systems, it is really fundamentally going to be about learning how to be efficient, less profligate with code. And, that's going to come as a shock to both the people and the companies. I mean, we got here through like phraseology like scale is all you need, right? And computer scientists love to remind themselves of the bitter lesson of like, we actually haven't done anything all that impressive other than bring more compute online. So if you try to actually get the signal of being clever of our AI advances, there's very little clever signal. All the cleverness is actually coming from, these folks, not the world of software that I represent. So that's gonna change fundamentally over the next 10 years, and it's going to require an entirely different design principle within the field of software engineering. Again, we can help our people by designing that into the AI systems that are helping our people write their code. And so we just need to be thoughtful about it, but I do believe that that's a huge thing that's coming.
So to answer your question around community, I think there's a couple things NVIDIA has been very sort of always focused on. Like when you think about the challenge of creating what we called accelerated computing, no one did it. So it really involved, building an entire community, an entire ecosystem from nothing. Because x86, general purpose CPU-driven programming was the model. So it truly was about creating a whole new way of computing. And the reason that is because, there was some benefit. Either it was performance, we like to think it was energy efficiency. So that's sort of in our DNA. So a lot of what we're trying to do with that same revolution that's happened with AI is how do we get a community built around that? So we have, our AI university, which is basically provided to a number of schools and community organizations. We just signed a program with the state of California looking to offer free training to teachers and students to get them on board this AI revolution, because in addition to not having them impacted by climate, we also don't want to be left behind by the opportunity that's presented by AI. So it's really about how can we, empower and sort of provide as much access as possible to the benefits that we think will be ascribed to AI. The other thing that we've been doing, and I've heard folks talk about the development community, we've hosted hackathons for a number of years at all the DOE supercomputing centers, and recently we did something about 2 years ago. We included what was called an energy efficiency calculator. Because typically what happens is the developers show up, they bring their application, they accelerate a kernel, they'll get a speed up. And like, oh, that's cool. And so we said, okay, what does that mean to your energy? And so we literally provided it to them. And one, it was really sort of eye-opening in that they never thought about it. They always thought, I'm just doing it to get faster. But in providing them the tools to understand the trade-offs they were making, okay, when you're running on that CPU, yes, it's slower, but you take a lot more of them. So we had something called a node replacement factor. It takes a lot more of them to do that same work, so you're going to end up consuming more energy in the future. So it was really about connecting the dots between the work they were doing to accelerate and build better applications, to also understanding that it has a sort of a lasting impact on the energy they were going to consume ultimately as well. So that's one example.
That's great. I love that story about the energy efficiency on the hackathon. Well, great answers. Thank you. Why don't we open it up to the audience now for questions? Oh, do you see one? I can't see it over there. Oh, there's a question over there. I know. I can't see the poll.
Hi, thank you all for your time today. You all talked about how the need to meet the demand will require a lot of collaboration. How do you all convince a growing ecosystem of competitors and potential competitors to all work with each other to deal with this issue?
So I'll go first. Actually, in the tech industry, it's old hat. We have come together to solve things like supply chain assurance sorts of problems, clean energy purchasing, together in a non-competitive way so that we don't have all the legal challenges associated with that. And actually, it's been very, very successful. If you think about our supply chain, now there's an organization called the Responsible Business Alliance, and RBA started as HP and a couple other companies' code of conduct. We would go into a factory and see that the manufacturing was happening that met our standards, but the assembly line right next to it producing somebody else's product wasn't doing any of that. And we said, why? And they said, they're not making us. So we took a step back and said, we cannot solve this problem ourselves. We have to do it through collaboration. So yeah, there's a lot of examples. You still see that here. We take our approach to IT efficiency and make it freely available to anybody that wants to leverage it, because we don't get better till we're singing from the same sheet of music, if you will, till we're using common metrics that everybody agrees are those metrics, and where they don't exist, like in the efficiency of an AI software application or an AI model, we're getting together as an industry and through groups like IEEE to actually go develop those yardsticks so that everybody's in agreement how the industry does product carbon footprints. We all came together and said, common need. We got MIT and other academics involved, and now the common tool is called PIA. So I think there's lots of examples of how we do that and do it well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I mean, I think when you look at the competitive dynamics within the tech, especially in the compute sector, it is kind of, I won't say Jekyll and Hyde-ish, but it's in essence where you have to be, very vertically integrated, but very horizontally disaggregated. Because ultimately, your solutions have to work together. Like anytime you're building, a system or a computer or a data center, you have to understand that every customer, every user is going to have their imprint on what that ultimately looks like. So by definition, you have to be amenable to working with quote unquote your competitors. I'll just use some examples to say that NVIDIA builds lots of different elements in the solution stack. But if someone buys an HP supercomputer and say we want to use Slingshot, that's perfectly fine. That works. And then another thing that I think was interesting, OCP is coming up in another couple of weeks. That's an open compute project, was kind of founded by Meta. But what was interesting is when I look at some of the contributions we made, we were recently looking at that. We made a contribution of our HGX sort of compute chassis. That is so anti-competitive. Like if you were looking at a strategic effort where you wanted to sandbox your position in the market, you would say, no way I'm going to give this to the community to make everyone sort of be able to innovate and build on top of that. But you see that collaboration happening, and again, it's done willingly. No one's asking us to do it. There's no regulator forcing us to do it. But we understand that there's a contribution that can be made to the broader community. So I think there's much more of a sense of community than people understand and realize, at least within the tech sector. So I'm less concerned about that collaboration than the collaboration I think Lucas spoke about in terms of getting outside those main groups there.
Yeah, and just jumping on, not to be the downer, but there is one roadblock to collaboration that isn't the lack of desire to collaborate, and Dion already mentioned it when he added a third sector, which is regulators. And oftentimes you look and it's the same government that's telling you that you need to decarbonize, that's telling you that you can't work with your competitors to go out and send a common price signal into the market because that's anti-competitive. And so I do think we need to have a bit of a regulatory reckoning on this particular issue about when competition is healthy and when competition is not healthy for us to reach broader societal goals. And those put shareholders and society on two different sides of kind of the aisle, and we are just starting to slowly have that conversation. And so I actually think I would just echo your points. I would just say there's probably way more pent up collaboration like demand within the sector, then we're actually allowed to deploy.
Additional questions?
You spoke about redundancy, right? And you said you want to, well, like mission critical thing. For example, for MTA, like our operating system, you want to reduce the redundancy. But you also talk about we have to change the company to tackle the essentially KPI, right? So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so let me give you a couple examples. The way data centers used to be designed, particularly mission critical data centers, is there were everything that could fail had at least two of. Uptime Institute actually had ratings. They had tiers of resiliency of data centers, and they would talk about 2N, which means everything has at least two. So if you need one server, you have two. If that server has one power feed, it also has a redundant power feed, and those power feeds to the device are independent all the way back to two different generation stations, if you will. And then there's 2N plus 1, which is you do that plus you add an extra one in just in case. And then with virtualization, you could actually run the same workload multiple places. I'm told in some of the public cloud providers, if you store a bit of data, if you take the picture and you back up your phone in the cloud, that's not backed up one place, that's backed up at least 9. And if you pay for additional resiliency, if you're a business customer, they do it 9 times in 2 different availability zones. So there's a tremendous amount of resiliency. Well, as technology has gotten better and virtualization and containerization, these techniques that allow you to have one physical device appear to be multiple devices, much of that redundancy is no longer necessary, and yet you can still have the same level of resiliency. And in fact, resiliency companies demonstrate this. They'll have a data center operating, and they'll literally blow it up to see how quickly the mirror of it can pick up the workload so that the user never knew that anything happened. And you can do that with less and less space. The other thing that's happened over time, and Dion alluded to this as well, is as performance per watt has improved almost logarithmically, what it took 6 years ago, 11 devices to do, you can do today that same amount of work with 1. I don't know of any company that I've ever worked with in the world that went from 11 to 1. They might from 11 to 6, partially because, again, they get fired if the workloads go down. So it means they're way over provisioned, even though they cut 50% and decarbonized a whole bunch, but they could have gone so much further. So part of this, by the way, is getting more comfortable with these technology improvements and recognizing that they have a high degree of resiliency and we don't need all the redundancy behind it.
Other questions? Oh, down here in front. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is about goal setting and alignment. PUE has been out there for more than 10 years or so, and yet it seems that people year after year complain that it's an imperfect measure of effectiveness and ultimately efficiency. And we've seen in other industries that when you don't have standards, when you don't have performance expectations, you get a prevalence of greenwashing. Right? You have everybody establishing their own measure of effectiveness or efficiency or sustainability. How does this industry reconcile the goals and the relative way to calculate effectiveness and efficiency on a standard scale?
Yeah, so I'll go first. So PUE was designed or invented by the Green Grid almost decades ago, I think. And it was really designed for an individual operator to measure how efficient they were and see if they're getting better over time. It was never designed to compare. And often, because people wanted to game it, they drew their fence line at various places to game the number. So it was good for its time. And then water use efficiency and carbon use efficiency that came behind it were great too. But because the industry did not come up with some metrics, and by the way, there's not one, you're going to need about 10. Actually, in the EU Energy Efficiency Directive set out a set of metrics and now requires data centers starting this year to report on all of them. Some they will publicly disclose. So if you're in a community, you can see the energy consumption and the percentage of renewables in all the data centers in your community. It'll be online and you can see it. Some of the data points will not be disclosed. Most of them are pretty straightforward. Device level utilization is still being debated in a best case metric being decided. Until then, by the way, the devices all report out CPU utilization. Even though it's not perfect, that's what exists today. But one of the things that was my favorite, and you heard about it a little earlier, is the EU also required these data centers to report on if they're doing heat reuse or not. Because heat is the #1 waste product of IT, and yet it's a saleable resource. You just have to be co-located within about 10 kilometers of the person that's going to do beneficial use of that heat. So the EU is requiring the data centers to report on heat reuse. Germany, because when the EU passes a directive, the individual countries can actually go a little higher, much like states here in the United States can go above a federal requirement. Germany actually required 10% heat reuse, or tell us why that is not effective. And let me assure you, when a governmental body asks you to report data that they're concerned about, behind that, if they don't like the data that they're getting, will become some regulations pushing renewable energy use up, utilization levels up, or you won't get the permits to build the data centers. So we haven't seen much of that yet here in the United States. More what we get is activism against new data center construction, or places like Ireland that say, you just can't build them anymore. You guys aren't paying attention to what you're doing. So I think we could learn a lot, particularly from that EU directive, on how to get a slate of metrics that together suggest efficiency, although I would still say the EU ones still aren't considering software or data in that mix yet.
Joyce, were you going to say something on PUE as well?
Yeah, it's very much along the same lines as we look at it as, optimizing our efficiency of our data center. I'm not going to compare a data center in London with one in Japan with one in Finland, because you've got the weather makes a lot of difference, and the way you've had to design and build the data center makes difference. But we use it to look at, how well are we managing our own operations, and that's what we really care about, and that's how we looked at it at my prior employers too.
And one thing I'll add to that is I think it is interesting when you look at the measurement of efficiency, quotient being numerator denominator. Output should be a consideration, right? In other words, when you look at how efficient your car is, you say it can go 30 miles a gallon, or it can go, right? You don't look at how much it weighs. Although that might be indicative of the efficiency, it's not indicative of how the usage is going to impact the overall environment. So I would advocate that that's something that we should be thinking about, is understanding specific output per watt or output per resource consumed. But again, it gets really hard to do it because I think, as John alluded to, you'll need 10 different measures, because each application is a little bit different in terms of how you would measure that. And so I think that's one thing that's a little bit challenging, is you don't have the one number. And I'll use a case in point, which is supercomputing. They have HPL. Most people in the scientific community agree that HPL is very much useless. Right? Like, it has very little indication of how performant your system is going to be on an actual application. But it is one number that they can run and use to say, I deliver this much performance. And they have something called the Green 500, which suggests you look at the amount of HPL that you can produce, or high impact benchmark is what it's called. And you basically look at how many watts it consumed to run that. And of course, there's different ways you can measure the power. Some people game that too. But that gives you some measure that you can equivocally say, this system is more efficient than this system, therefore, they get a gold star. So while that's great, it's incomplete in its own right, because, like I said, it's not a true measure of application performance, because, depending on the application and how it uses the underlying infrastructure, you may get wildly different results. So I say all that to say it is a hard problem to solve, but I think some understanding and incorporation of the output of the system should be considered when you're really looking at the effectiveness of how efficiently it's using the underlying resources.
Right. Well, yes, one more question, please.
Thank you. My question would be more on, we've been focused on the energy and the electrons, kind of the invisible part, but what about the physical infrastructure? And what's the plan to decarbonize that or to get rid of it potentially, but like steel and cement and all of it? So what's your...
So big scope 3, sort of the embodied carbon in the construction is a real issue. And that is someplace that we are trying to collaborate on because the biggest embodied carbon in a data center is, just as you said, concrete and steel. And, you know, depending on where you're building, sometimes those are available and sometimes they aren't. But we really push in our design guides for our contractors, we push, you know, certain levels of decarbonized concrete and steel in order to minimize our carbon footprint. The other thing that we're doing with our data centers is we are actually designing them to be flexible by design. So as compute evolves and as AI has more and more demands, we don't have to tear down a data center and build a new one. We can actually reuse and repurpose many parts of it. And that's really one of our goals, is to have these enduring buildings that can grow and evolve as the industry evolves as well. But it's, you know, if you have carbon and steel opportunities, I would love to talk to you.
Yeah, and I would just add, one of the other things that's happening across the spectrum in the industry is part of the reason we need data centers, frankly, is because we have a whole bunch of stuff that needs a certain temperature, humidity spectrum to operate effectively in, and a whole lot of power in a very small space. Well, actually, if you can change some of those, so for example, edge devices now can run in much hotter or much colder and much wider humidity bands, so you don't need much of that infrastructure if all you need is some localized compute. Think of spaceborne computer that we have right now on the space station. It used to be that every experiment that happened in space had to send all of its data back to the Earth over what is basically a dial-up, if you want to think about speed and pipe size, to get an answer.
Do they know what dial-up is? Are you sure?
Yeah. Does anybody even know what dial-up is? Back before you got to the internet over a phone line and it was really slow. If you've ever heard the static and then you got mail, that's the connection.
I think we're losing them. We're losing them.
So I tell you all of that to say, instead, and why was that? Because compute devices in space are bombarded with a lot of radiation and they degrade quickly. So the problem we had to solve is, could we fly commercial hardware in the space station and get it to self-tune as it degraded to keep adapting to that degradation? The answer is yes. So instead of building a data center down here to process data from the space station, we just put an edge device on the space station, which has enabled a lot more research to happen. So again, there's not one way to fix that problem. It's decarbonizing where you need the data centers. Don't have a data center where you don't, plus probably 10 other things.
And even though you said not to, I'll bring it back to electrification, because in the scope 3 supply chain, even in these real physical industrial asset kind of economies, that half of those emissions are coming from energy use that either are already electrified but haven't made the inroads into renewable energy use that the tech sector has, or they are coming from other energy sources that new technologies are going to come online to electrify, from steel to cement to semiconductor manufacturing. I mean, that is the elephant in the room from a tech perspective. If you look at the big CSPs, that's where they're unable to kind of move things. And I mean, you probably know the stats better than me, but there's two, segments of emissions from the semiconductor industry. One is like the actual high GWP like etching process, and the other is the energy use of just like operating and managing those facilities. Right. And if you look at the semiconductor industry, renewable energy purchasing versus the renewable energy purchasing of the people who buy and run the semiconductors, night and day difference, right? And so there's huge opportunities. I mean, you know me, so I say this, but I always say chase every electron. Yeah. Chase every electron you can possibly find. And if you find something that is a molecule but could be an electron, transform it, because it's the single most cost-effective way to decarbonize our society.
Well, that's great. Well, with that, I have one final question for the panelists, and then we'll close up. So, this year's Climate Week, the theme is "It's Time," right? This urgency. So, with that theme, one final question for each of you. What's your recommendation for our audience in terms of what's the call to action right now that we need people to focus on to help us keep moving forward and keep finding these solutions?
Oh, so many. One I'll do. So I started in data centers in 2008 in what we call sort of the Clean Tech 1.0 world, and was doing data centers at Stanford University and then with Google. And then I left, and there was a lot of great work done. And then I left for about 6 years and just came back actually 6 months ago. And the world has changed. Like, the outside world is completely different than it was in 2008, 2009. But the data centers haven't really changed. And there is such an opportunity to change that. And that's why I came out of sort of semi-retirement to do this, because we're looking at how do we change the industry? How do we change the buildings, change the industry, support this compute that's going to do fantastic things with this world, but we can't destroy the planet in the process. And so I'm looking at, and we're looking at startups that are tackling all elements of this infrastructure and support, and there is such a huge opportunity on that front. And so my advice is get into that space, that intersection of the grid and industrial infrastructure. Everything has to change, and it all has to electrify in order to actually clean our economy, because that's the best way to do it, with renewable energy and infrastructure that supports doing more of what we're doing. Don't stop things, empower it.
That's great.
Yeah, and to just sort of echo that point, but phrase it a little bit differently, and this might sound self-serving, so I'll apologize in advance, but I really believe there's an opportunity to accelerate everything. And so NVIDIA was founded on this computing model, which is if you do it smartly, you can do it with less energy. And so today there's tons of workloads. Right now, AI is roughly about 12 to 15% of the workloads that are in the data center. There's tons of workloads that are still using what we would call sort of less optimal computing methods. So the first thing for NVIDIA is accelerate everything. And so we're working with ISVs to accelerate databases. We just announced at Oracle World that we're accelerating their database. So there's nothing more tried and true than an Oracle database. But those are applications that have been running on CPUs for decades. We're accelerating CFD applications. But once you've accelerated everything, so again, that's the first thing. Second thing, we believe that we think that AI did not get us into this mess, but if we're going to get out of it, we're going to have to innovate our way out. We're not necessarily going to curtail our way out and just stop using power. I think, to your point, renewables will be front and center there. But AI is really going to be a useful tool to help go and tackle the rest of the carbon emissions. So when you think about this numbers that we've thrown out, right, 2 to 4% in the US, 1 to 2 globally, how do we help go and tackle that other 96%? Like, how do we reduce sort of the consumption of manufacturing, of the heavy industries? And a lot of that's going to be driven by solutions that are powered by AI, or that are going to enable us to do things, innovate faster, to produce things like fusion energy, to produce newer, more efficient cements and materials for battery storage. So that innovation portion is something that I think a lot of people are doing in their daily jobs, their lives. And that work, I think, has to really get a spotlight, because there's a ton of it happening. I've been hearing a lot about it this week. So I think that would be the other part of that sort of call to action, is continue to leverage AI, but for issues that really tackle that other 96% of carbon contribution.
Yeah, and I'm going to make this really simple. If you're a sustainability professional in the room, go meet your technology colleagues, go see your technology operations. You might discover they're the largest part of your carbon footprint if you're a non-manufacturing company. If you're a technology professional sitting in the room, go meet your sustainability colleagues. As much as I like both groups, I'm tired of introducing them to one another in the same company that I'm in to visit. So get to know one another, have a coffee, meet on an ongoing basis. And I'm going to suggest a technique that I learned as a young engineer at NASA in mishap investigation school. Ask why 5 times. Why do we do it this way? and you'll get an answer. Well, why is that the only way? Get an answer. Well, really, what about this other approach? Ask why 5 times, and you've probably gotten to the root of the topic, and you've sort of ferreted out some things that everybody thought had to be, or that's the way we always did it, that you can say, how about let's have a change by working together?
Well, before I end it, I'll just say, Dion, deep respect for your nuanced phraseology around Oracle's legacy. You're a master of the craft. But I think, look, what I would say is just kind of reflecting what I've been saying, which is, and this is like kind of a scary time to be alive, right? There's a lot going on politically, climatically, environmentally, technologically. And you can either wake up every day really scared about that, or you can wake up every day really excited about it. And the way that I think about it is like, yes, recognize the risk, but spend your time embracing the opportunity. So I don't wake up every day wondering or scared if AI is going to take my job. I wake up every day thinking about how I can be better at my job by using AI. Just like I don't wake up every day wondering, how I stop the, omnipresent rise of digital technologies in the kind of socioeconomic fabric of our lives. I spend my time thinking about how do I make sure that that is a solution, not a cause of our macro kind of environmental and economic problems. And so for me, it really is just a mindset shift, because we can do all these things, but we have half of the people telling us that we shouldn't do anything. And we kind of need everybody doing everything right now. So I would encourage you to be part of that everybody doing everything crowd.
That's great. The idea of embracing the opportunity is a great note to end on. Thank you. Thank you so much to the panelists. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you joining us. WSP was honored to host this panel during Climate Week. Thank you to the audience for coming. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And please join us at a reception over here so we can continue this great conversation. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.